Hi there. Thank you for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you. When I was young, I had an uncle, a mentor figure in my life named Ellis. He was half Lakota Sioux, half Apache. He was born on a wagon out west during the Depression. And he was incredibly well-read and he had a tough life, but he was a real fountain of wisdom and knowledge for me. And at one point when I was young, he said, and this is the way he said it, he said, it's funny, all throughout the history of this country, along the frontier, white people were always running off to join us Indians. But we Indians never ran off to join the white people. He said there was something about tribal society that even though it existed in the natural world, that these were hunter-gatherers, they lived tough lives, there was something about tribal society that was incredibly appealing, even to people from modern society that enjoyed the benefits of modern society. And that always stuck in my mind. I liked the idea of it. I wondered if it was true. I hoped it was true. And I started to look into it. And indeed, even Benjamin Franklin wrote about this phenomenon, that people kept absconding to the tribes, and the reverse never happened. I even found a letter from a woman who was kidnapped along the frontier, adopted into a tribe, and refused to be repatriated. And she wrote a letter addressing the women of the colonies, saying, "You women in your cities have none of the rights that I have. I can marry when I want, I can divorce when I want, I can decide how my life is going to be, and you can't." There seemed to be a fundamental egalitarianism in tribal society that really did not exist in the class-conscious society of the colonies and of America, and frankly of America today. Decades later, I was a war reporter, and I found myself at a remote outpost called Restrepo in eastern Afghanistan. I was with a platoon of combat infantry. It was all men in this unit. And there were 20 guys on this hilltop. They were completely cut off from the world. They had no internet. They had no telephone lines back to their families back home. They had no electricity for a while. They slept shoulder to shoulder in the dirt. And they were endured an enormous amount of combat. Sometimes they didn't change their clothes for a month at a time. It was flies and tarantulas and combat and filth for 15 months for these guys. And I was out there with them. And when they came home, when they came back to Vicenza, Italy, where they're based, I caught up with them a few months later. And as you can imagine, they had some pretty good parties planned for when they got back to Vicenza. But after that wore off, something else set in. And they told me that, as odd as this sounded, they wanted to go back to Restrepo. They did not want to come home to the United States. And suddenly I remembered Ellis. I remembered what he said about the frontier, and it occurred to me, what is it about modern society which is so hard to come home to? Why do people who have been exposed to a different way of living not want to return to this way of living, which clearly has so many enormous blessings and benefits? I studied anthropology in college, and I started to think about the problem in those terms. And I realized a platoon in combat actually recreates our evolutionary past incredibly well. When we know from archaeology, from anthropology, that humans evolved, we're a social species, we're social primates. We evolved to live in groups of 30 or 40, 50 people, exactly the size of a platoon, in a harsh environment, completely dependent on one another for our safety. That's the experience of a soldier in combat. And so what they were experiencing was the incredible security of the communal experience. Primates do not survive in nature by themselves. Humans don't, other primates don't. If you're by yourself in the natural world, you die. Our strength, our survival, in some ways our greatness, comes from the fact that we exist in groups. We don't have claws, we don't have big teeth, but we can make tools and we band together, we can communicate, we can organize ourselves, and in groups we survive. What happens with soldiers is that they experience the communality of our past incredibly intensely, and then we pick these people up and we drop them down in the great American suburb. This is probably the first time in history that large numbers of people have the luxury, if you want to call it that, have the luxury of sleeping completely by themselves in their own air-conditioned bedroom. That is not what we evolved for. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans have slept in groups. Their security came from the fact that they were in a group. I literally slept better. I slept more peaceably in Afghanistan in an outpost that got attacked something like 300 or 400 times during the deployment. I literally slept better in those close quarters with those men than the times I've gone camping by myself in the woods of New England. Nothing's going to kill me in the woods of New England, but the wiring of my brain does not know that, and I feel in danger. So, when you look at modern society, what you have is a society where the individual does not need a community in order to survive. And the community does not need individuals in order to remain intact, in order to get through life, in order to get through the tasks that need to be done. And because of that individualism in society, we have enormous personal liberty, which is a good thing. But on the downside, we suffer from a kind of chronic alienation. So as wealth goes up in a society, the suicide rate goes up. As wealth and modernity go up in a society, the depression rate tends to go up. The US military has a PTSD rate estimated to be around 25%. 1 in 4 soldiers are thought to suffer from PTSD. That is odd because only around 10% of the military actually engages in combat. There's a real possibility that some of the very real psychological troubles that our soldiers are facing when they come home isn't necessarily derived from trauma. I mean, obviously, as a species, we're wired to overcome enormous hardship and trauma. If that were not true, we wouldn't exist. We would not have survived. It may be that they're suffering from a kind of transition disorder. And if they are, they're not alone. Peace Corps volunteers, when they come back from their service overseas, typically in a small communal environment, a village in the developing world, experience a depression rate of around 25%. It used to be called culture shock. It's very, very hard to come back to modern society because you were stripped of the safety of communal existence. I talked to a Vietnam vet he was a LRP, long-range reconnaissance patrol, incredibly intense job. Dropped behind enemy lines, 3 or 4 man teams, out there for weeks at a time, no air support, no medic. This guy did several tours, and he came back to the United States. He felt so alienated that he eventually returned to Vietnam and married the daughter of a Viet Cong commander. And he said in that woman's village, he finally found his tribe. He felt like he belonged somewhere. And finally, I talked to a young woman at one point who suffered from cancer. And when she got sick, her community, her tribe, her family gathered around her to support her as she went through the awful process of chemotherapy. And she told me this story, and she said, I beat the odds, I made it. And she looked at me really sadly and said, and now I miss being sick. So if you have people who miss cancer, who miss war, who miss, frankly, the incredibly difficult day-to-day life of a poor African, living in a poor African village, if you have people who miss those things, something is missing in their lives. Now, I don't want you to think that we are somehow physically, genetically different from people in tribal societies. We have not changed in any significant way, genetically, physically, as a species, in about 20,000 years. We haven't even, we're just beginning to make genetic changes to accommodate the change in diet when agriculture was invented 10,000 years ago. We are just getting around to adapting to that. So we are the same as our Stone Age ancestors. So that means that the wiring that we have that allows us to thrive in small communal groups, that is still intact, that's still there. So when you take modern society and collapse it, you don't see chaos, right? The interesting thing about humans is the worse things get, the better people act. Pro-social behaviors come out when they're needed, when human society as a whole or small communities are faced with catastrophe and hardship and danger. The Blitz in London, 30,000 Londoners were killed by German bombs over a 6-month period. You all know the stories, horror show. The authorities were worried that psychiatric disorders would explode during the Blitz, that there would be mass psychiatric casualties during the Blitz. And actually, the opposite happened. During the bombings in those 6 months, admissions to psych wards went down during the Blitz. As one surprised English official said, "We have neurotics driving ambulances." The first war that I covered was Sarajevo in the Bosnian Civil War, a besieged city that went through hell. 1/5 of the population were killed or wounded by the enemy that surrounded the city. And I recently talked to a woman who survived that. She was badly wounded. She survived it. She went through hell. And she said to me, she literally lowered her voice and said to me, "You know, the funny thing is, we all missed the war because we were better people during the war. We looked out for each other. We were more generous. We acted better." The key to this is that when you act on behalf of a group, you feel good. You feel good for some very, very strong evolutionary reasons, because it means you're part of a group and therefore you're safe. If you're needed and you're acting well in a group, you are safe. That is the basic evolutionary equation that you have to remember. And then you have to look at modern society and ask, how much do we provide the opportunity for people to do that, for people to act that way? We're not going to burn down the suburbs. We're not going to all live in lean-tos. We are the society we are, and there are enormous benefits that come with that. And I think I will end with this. I think there is one thing we can do to make a change, a societal change that allows us all to feel like we're more part of a tribe, if you want to use that word, that we all have a shared interest in the future, common concerns. And that is, no one in a community where everyone depends on each other speaks with contempt about other people in that community. Out at Restrepo, I never heard a soldier speak with contempt about another soldier, because they didn't all like each other, but they never spoke with contempt. You don't speak with contempt about someone you may need tomorrow to save your life, or vice versa. And I think one of the things, honestly, and I don't care what your politics are, I think in either side, it doesn't matter, I think one of the things that is seriously affecting our sense of community, our sense of belonging to something, is the incredibly disrespectful rhetoric that is occurring at the top levels of government and of our society. It is a threat to our democracy in a way that ISIS never will be. Because when people speak with contempt about a rival politician or about segments of our country, when you do that, you are basically saying, listen, there's no there. Like this is not a unity. This is a division, this is a collection of competing interests, and some are more deserving than others. That's what you're saying when you speak with contempt. And that will be the ruin of the country if we don't stop it. And we, the people, have empowered very powerful people, and we can withdraw that power. And we have to remember that when we insist on certain standards of behavior in this amazing, amazing country that we have. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.